Good morning and welcome to the ISO Board of Governors General Session Meeting. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and all attendee lines are currently muted until the public comment portion of the call. We will make sure to give you all instructions on how to enter the comment queue at that time. With that, I'll now go ahead and turn the call over to ISO Board of Governors Chair Jan Shorey. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Welcome all to this special meeting of the ISO Board of Governors, which has been convened to continue the discussion we began at the May 23rd meeting on reforming the interconnection queue process. The proposal, as you all know, is very complex. To all of our stakeholders who have submitted comments, thank you. I know that I and the other board members have appreciated and benefited from your input, and we will welcome any comments you may wish to make today as we determine what is the next action to be taken. With that, I will turn it over to Roger Collington, our Corporate Secretary and General Counsel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Good morning. Let's go ahead and have our roll call. And we'll start with you, Chair Shorey.
Here.
Vice Chair Borenstein.
Here.
Governor Edo.
Here.
Governor Galitova.
Present.
And Governor Leslie.
Present.
All right. With that, we always on our board agendas, open meetings, allow for general public comment on items which are not on the agenda. So with that, I'll turn it back to Roger to see if we have any comments today.
Okay. Silas, can you check and see if there's any comments? We have no comment letters. Can you check if there's any comments on the line?
If you would like to make a public comment, please press the raise hand icon on Zoom. Or if you are dialed into our phone only line, you can press #2 to enter the comment queue. We have one public comment from Matthew Plummer. Matthew, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
I'm sorry, I meant to get in the queue for the next item. My apologies.
Okay, copy that. With that, there are no further public comments in the queue.
Excellent. Thank you, Silas. Chair Shorey, the next item, if you don't mind, since it's mine, I'll just continue on that in the interest of time. So agenda item now.
Roger, you just cut out. Roger? Roger, I can't hear you.
You're breaking up, Roger. Try again.
All right, how about now? All right, now.
It's better. Keep going.
No.
Oh, not great.
Okay.
Here,
I'm not hearing anything.
it stays. So here we have a decision for the general session minutes for May 23, 2024. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Joe, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know why my internet decided to do that right at that moment.
That's good. Thanks
yes,
very much.
Okay.
I think you're back on, and so with that, we're going to move to the main item of the day. Further discussion and a possible decision on the interconnection process enhancements proposal. So with that, I will go ahead. Roger, is there anything further for you? Oh, you need to do the public comment letters first. Let me turn it over to Roger.
Okay, and hopefully my internet will last through this. So for the record, we advise that we have 12 public comment letters that were submitted. They've all been provided to the board on this item, and those 12 were from the California Wind Energy Association, the Clean Energy Buyers Association, Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technology, NGNA, ENGIENA, and Independent Energy Producers Association, a large-scale solar association, Northern California Power Agency, Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, Solar Energy Industries Association, TerraGen LLC, and California Energy Storage Alliance. And again, all of those letters have been submitted, have been provided to the board for the record.
Yes, thank you everyone for submitting those written comments. All the board members have had an opportunity to review them in preparation for today's meeting. And so we appreciate the active engagement and involvement of all of you. With that, I think we're ready to proceed to the staff presentation. So I'll turn it over to Neil Miller.
Thank you very much, Chair Shori. And today I will be asking Danielle Mills, our Principal Infrastructure Policy Development, to present to you for consideration and approval our final proposal of the 2023 Interconnection Process Enhancements effort. Before Danielle presents the decision item, I would first like to thank you, our Board of Governors, and our stakeholder community for accommodating this special meeting. The conversation today is the continuation of the comprehensive briefing provided at the May 23rd Board of Governors meeting and provided additional time for stakeholders to express concerns or support to you via letters, and for us to consider that input and provide more comprehensive responses than would otherwise have been the case. The overall proposal remains as presented on May 23rd, with the exception of one change made in response to significant stakeholder comments and reflected in the final addendum provided to you as part of the decision item. Danielle will speak to that change. I also cannot overstate the importance of this initiative and the challenges the team and our stakeholders faced in developing these transformative changes to our interconnection process. The reformed process is fundamental to ensuring the most viable resources continue to achieve interconnection, to maintaining reliability cost effectively, and to integrating procurement activities and transmission planning. The changes Danielle will describe will impact everyone. Aligned with the coordination in place with state agencies and local regulatory authorities, the intent is to fundamentally shift interconnection study efforts to areas that align with our transmission plan based on integrated resource plans and reflect the procurement responsibilities of load-serving entities while continuing to maintain open access to the transmission system and a strong competitive market for new generation. The fundamental transformation we are seeking to implement is to shift more meaningful project development and procurement engagement to earlier stages in the interconnection study process. Today, the bulk of that activity takes place after a project has received interconnection study results. While these changes will be disruptive and uncomfortable, they are necessary so that the ISO can deliver meaningful study results more quickly and phase out the habit of using the ISO interconnection process to simply screen potential sites. As I mentioned on May 23rd, our existing interconnection processes proved very effective for over a decade in managing significant numbers of interconnection applications. But the consequences of the overheated queue and excessive numbers of projects applying for interconnection in different areas are becoming more impactful every day. These consequences are even more pronounced now that the Cluster 14 projects that received interconnection results earlier this year are now receiving the results of deliverability allocations tied to planned future transmission upgrades and local upgrades identified through the interconnection process. The current process simply is no longer sustainable. The team worked with our stakeholders through numerous working group sessions, laying the foundation for the proposals and multiple rounds of stakeholder proposals, papers, presentations, and comments as the ISO's final proposal took shape. And I have to thank our stakeholders as well for the tremendous efforts that got us to this point. That being said, while many of the concepts included in this final proposal evolved from stakeholder proposals and comments, not everyone will be getting everything they may have sought, and there will continue to be conflicting differences of opinion as to the best path forward. Many in the resource development community continue to share the same concerns expressed earlier with the depth of the transformative changes we are proposing here. And while we do truly appreciate their concern and have done our very best to address them, Management remains resolved that these changes are absolutely necessary to meet the infrastructure challenges facing California in a reliable, efficient, and cost-effective fashion. Seeking your approval of the decision item in the face of those concerns is not a step we take lightly. The primary area of concern relates to applying scoring criteria to ensure that we are studying realistic numbers of interconnection requests in areas where transmission is planned and available, and that we can provide reasonable and actionable study results, enabling viable projects to move forward. Within those criteria, the input from load-serving entities has drawn particular concern. The ISO management views earlier load-serving entity engagement as a critical linkage between the resource and transmission portfolios and the interconnection queue. The process designed will provide a viability screen to increase the likelihood that the projects advancing to the interconnection study process advance to commercial offtake and are placed into service. We have also recognized the role of commercial off-takers with the proposal that recognizes the valuable service they provide in helping new generation and storage resources move forward, and also balancing the overarching responsibilities of load-serving entities and their supply obligations to customers. I do believe the final proposal has threaded the needle on a comprehensive and cohesive package that will help the ISO and stakeholders bring the queue to more reasonable study volumes. Subject to your approval, management also intends to craft its tariff application for these changes, with certain key aspects also being severable, so that in the event FERC does not find some aspects of our filing compelling, the ISO will nevertheless be left with an actionable path forward, even if less than ideal. As Danielle will explain, this is also not a one-and-done framework. Management also intends to monitor a number of key considerations and, if necessary, explore additional refinements ahead of the next cluster, Cluster 16. So with that, I will now turn the mic over to Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning, governors. Thank you for your time this morning and for all the time that you've put in leading up to this decision item and really trying to understand a complex but very important proposal. I'm going to provide a higher level overview of the final proposal than I provided at the May meeting, but I do want to call your attention right away to the final addendum and the board memo, both of which outline one change to the final proposal that's really intended to increase the transparency and rigor of the load-serving entity allocation process. In particular, we're planning to require load-serving entities to opt into the process and publicly post both contact information for the department or individual responsible for the process, as well as publicly posting selection criteria for allocating capacity. So we'll review that in detail, but again, the intent there is to respond to a lot of the stakeholder concerns that we heard and make sure that we're really creating a process that has good integrity and alignment with existing jurisdictional requirements and oversight levels. So I do want to start the presentation with just some context again of where we are with our interconnection queue. And the ISO's interconnection process has long been held up as one of the best in the country, with relative ease of submitting interconnection applications and an efficient process of interconnecting resources and studying projects to advance to commercial operations. However, the past two cycles have brought unprecedented increases in interconnection requests, reflecting the need to onboard new resources to provide near-term policy and reliability. You can see our trajectory for clusters 5 through 13, where we were processing roughly 100 to 150 interconnection requests on a very timely basis. The problem of receiving now 2 to 4 times historical volumes and 3 to 4 times our future need in interconnection requests is not just a workload issue, but it compromises the actual value of the study results. So a principle that was established during the working group process is that study results lose their accuracy, meaning, and utility when the level of interconnection request capacity is multiple times the existing or planned transmission capacity for an area. We're now seeing cluster 14 results, as Neil mentioned, suggesting very long lead times because the studies included unreasonable levels of interconnection capacity in various zones. The entire queue, now including cluster 15, which has been on hold for the past year, currently has enough capacity to achieve California's 2045 policy requirements more than 3 times. These numbers and capacity volumes are no longer sustainable. And clusters 14 and 15 tell us that we need interconnection customers to bring more advanced and ready projects to the queue. I also want to note that given the current queue volume, the ISO split the final proposal into 2 separate sections. The first is interconnection request intake, which is where we've focused and where we've heard, I would say, the most stakeholder comment. But the second is also very important, and that's addressing clusters 14 and prior, which is the contract and queue management element of it, and making sure that we're actually processing interconnection requests that are currently in the queue and moving them forward toward commercial offtake, or if they're stagnating, withdrawing them so that they don't create bottlenecks for future projects. The cornerstone of the Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative is a 2022 Memorandum of Understanding that was signed between California ISO, the California Energy Commission, and the California Public Utilities Commission. This is really intended to tighten the linkages between resource planning and transmission planning, as well as resource procurement and interconnection. And I think we've seen the top half of this graphic bear fruit in the last 2 years with the last 2 transmission plans. But this initiative is really focusing on bringing the bottom of this graphic into view and connecting the resource procurement process with the transmission plan by ensuring that load-serving entities are procuring resources where available transmission capacity exists. We're also focusing on making sure that interconnection requests are prioritized in areas where there is available transmission capacity. So we need the load-serving entity engagement to make sure that there is a connection between the zones available for resource interconnection and the transmission plan. As part of this proposal, each year, the ISO will use the resource portfolios from the PUC and the local regulatory authorities and the annual transmission plan to determine the availability of capacity in each zone and to determine which zones are prioritized as either transmission plan deliverability zones, which are prioritized, or merchant zones. Transmission plan deliverability zones are zones where there is sufficient transmission capacity, and merchant zones are zones where there is not sufficient available capacity. The merchant pathway ensures that projects seeking to interconnect in areas with no available capacity have a path to become deliverable by providing the opportunity for those projects to both build and fund any required area delivery network upgrades as a merchant transmission project. We're also proposing treatment of energy-only projects that aligns with the Public Utilities Commission and local regulatory authorities' resource planning processes, enabling energy-only resources to interconnect and be reimbursed for network upgrades in areas where the need has been identified. So this is a high-level overview of the interconnection request intake process. And it starts with the ISO providing very important and up-to-date information to stakeholders, particularly interconnection customers, so that they can determine the best areas for interconnection. Only projects in transmission plan deliverability zones will actually advance through the next several steps on this graphic. Projects in merchant zones will not have to go through the scoring process and will not be subject to the 150% cap. The 150% cap is a cap on available transmission capacity and a means for the ISO to actually place a limit on the number and the volume of interconnection requests that we study. So we'll move to that in a moment. So the second column here is the interconnection request window. And in this window, interconnection customers will have to meet all current interconnection request requirements, including those now required by FERC Order 2023. The interconnection customers will also submit their scoring self-assessment to the ISO during this window. So as we've discussed, the ISO has imposed new scoring criteria that looks at commercial interest, system need, and project viability, and expects the interconnection customers to score themselves on those metrics. The only exception to that is the load serving entity allocation, which will come from load serving entities directly to the ISO. And as I mentioned before, the ISO is now requiring load serving entities to opt into the load serving entity allocation process and to post their selection criteria and contact information on a publicly accessible website at the beginning of and prior to the interconnection request window. So we've also provided a set of guidelines and expectations for interconnection customers and load serving entities in the final addendum, and want to ensure that this process is fair and transparent while still respecting jurisdictional authority of the CPUC and local regulatory authorities over procurement activities. The LSE allocation selection process is an important component of this proposal because it connects resource planning with the interconnection process and gives load serving entities an opportunity to engage and evaluate the commercial readiness of specific projects. Load serving entity allocations, as I said, will come in separately from the interconnection customers' scoring assessments. And for cluster 15, they'll come in 21 days after the window closes. But going forward, we propose 10 days. And the goal of this timing is to really front load the discussions between the load serving entities and the interconnection customers to make sure that they are having those early discussions about project attributes to the extent that details are available about those projects. And again, we want to see advanced projects coming to the interconnection process, though we understand that important factors like price and interconnection timelines will not be fully available until after the study is complete. Then we move to column 3, where the ISO will verify each project's point of interconnection to validate that it should proceed as a project in a transmission plan deliverability zone and is not behind any known constraints. This means that there will be available capacity for that project to interconnect and move these projects along to scoring. The 4th column is where the ISO will validate the documentation of site control and the total scores of each project by combining the self-assessment points with the load serving entity allocations for a total score. The highest scoring projects will have priority for moving forward to the study process. Then in column 5, the ISO will complete a constraint analysis and apply the 150% of available capacity limitation. So we'll determine the projects eligible for study by taking the highest scoring projects first and moving them into the study process until 150% of available transmission capacity is reached. Projects crossing that 150% threshold will be studied in their entirety. If there are ties, the ISO will use distribution factors, which are a measure of the project's impact to the grid at a particular location. Projects will be selected in order of the lowest distribution factor first, with the selection process ending with the project that crosses the 150% threshold to be exceeded, regardless of the size of that last project. And if project ties still exist, the ISO will conduct a sealed bid market clearing auction. From there, successful projects will be studied under the requirements outlined in FERC Order 2023. So the screening process is really designed to winnow down the pool of interconnection projects that the ISO studies to a more reasonable level so that we can provide more confident and accurate results to the interconnection customers regarding their interconnection costs and timelines. Reducing study volumes through these screens of commercial interest, project viability, and system need should also increase the certainty for projects that do get through this study process, as they've already begun discussions with potential buyers and have demonstrated their ability to bring real viable projects to the queue that will then compete for power purchase agreements and deliverability once they've been studied. I also want to highlight the queue management proposals to address some of the current projects in the queue. So first, the ISO proposes increasing the time to submit a limited operations study request to 9 months before synchronization. This is going to assist projects in knowing to what extent a project may be able to synchronize to the grid or must await completion of its assigned network upgrades. We're also proposing mechanisms to improve the consistency, amount, and frequency of data that we gather from inverter-based resources, and proposing limitations to the ability to transfer transmission plan deliverability, which has become a means to circumvent deliverability retention requirements and leads to many projects languishing in the queue. We're also requiring more stringent commercial viability criteria for a project to remain in the queue beyond 7 years, regardless of its deliverability status. And we're providing updates to the modification request process to reduce the numbers of modification requests that the ISO receives to more workable levels. Interconnection customers have also raised concerns that the PTOs are not meeting their milestone dates, particularly when it comes to shared network upgrades. And these are network upgrades that are required by more than one interconnection project. In some instances, the PTOs are waiting until all or the majority of interconnection customers responsible for the shared network upgrade have provided notice to proceed. So once the PTO has received a notice to proceed and third interconnection financial security posting from all of the impacted interconnection customers, it will now have 30 business days to commence working on those upgrades. So this is intended to prevent any further delays in processing and commencing work on those network upgrades. And lastly, the ISO proposes a new deposit to the ISO to compensate for project management and new resource implementation processes for each project in the queue. This deposit will only go to ISO-related processes, but importantly, the ISO will bill customers rather than include this in the transmission access charge, which would require ratepayer funding. So this is where I think we want to spend the most of our time, and this is on the stakeholder responses to the final proposal. And I would say that they do reflect the magnitude of changes we proposed. We understand that in order to do big things and bring significant amounts of new resources onto the grid, we need big changes to the process. So we have done our best to address each of these stakeholder comments and concerns. In particular, stakeholders, particularly on the final proposal, sought clarifications around implementation of the zonal approach. And I'll talk about our responses to this on the next slide as well, but we have provided those in the addenda. In addition, LSEs were broadly supportive of the proposal. However, we heard a number of developer concerns that are focused on, but not limited to, the scoring criteria. So with that, we've heard concerns about the fairness and the transparency of the load serving entity allocation process, specifically concerns that there were no public notice of selection criteria, and concerns that there may be inappropriate attempts to extract concessions from developers as part of this process. That's certainly not something that the ISO wants to see and is trying to incentivize. So we have addressed that, and we'll discuss that on the next slide as well. We've also heard concerns about the influence, the relative level of influence of load serving entities in the commercial interest category. That's currently set at about 30%. So roughly a third of the projects that advance to the study process are likely to have load serving entity points. And that weighting is intentional and intended to make sure that there is an important role for load serving entities, but not a totally determinative role of load serving entities in this process. We've also heard concerns around the proportion of load serving entity sponsored projects that may move forward to the study process, and concerns that there may be more emphasis placed on utility owned or load serving entity sponsored projects advancing to the study process, so that the study process is sort of stacked with projects from utilities. We have proposed limitations in the final proposal on utility-owned generation and load-serving entity projects based on historical levels. So we're really not intending to change or create any new incentives for utility-owned generation, but nonetheless have heard concerns. We've also heard concerns that the project viability and system need categories are less granular and more project specific. And so that may place additional emphasis on the load serving entities points. And what I will say to that is, and again, we'll address this on the next slide, but we did work very hard with stakeholders to develop scoring criteria that were objective, granular, and easily verifiable. And while we heard a lot of great ideas and explored a lot of ideas, what we've landed on, we do feel balances our ability to actually implement the scoring criteria and also reflect the diversity of resources that we plan to need going forward. We've also heard concerns from non-LSEs about their weighting compared to load-serving entities. Non-LSEs are commercial entities or financial entities. It's very broadly defined, if not undefined. And so we have created a separate process for receiving non-load serving entity interest in the process. And we've also heard different concerns from load serving entities and developers on the treatment of energy only projects. And as we've seen very few energy only projects in the queue for the last several years, we see this as a minimal concern, but something that we will absolutely continue to monitor. And finally, we've heard general support from all parties on contract and queue management proposals with some small requests for clarifications, which we've provided. Next slide, please. So we have responded to stakeholder concerns through a final addendum. And again, these responses are also included in the board memo. In particular, regarding clarifications to the zonal approach, the ISO held a workshop on May 16th and included a number of those clarifications in the various versions of the addenda. So hopefully we've resolved any significant questions around implementation of the zonal approach. It is quite complex, but we do intend to provide very accurate data in advance of the interconnection request and interconnection modification window for cluster 15 to make sure that stakeholders are comfortable with the data that they have and secure in knowing where they're planning to interconnect. We also expressed a commitment to monitoring various elements of the intake process and working with the PUC and local regulatory authorities to do so. Based on the concerns that we heard around the load serving entity allocation process and some of the concerns around a lack of transparency and potential for biased or preferential treatment in that process. We have been in discussions with the PUC about ways that we can monitor that, and we'll look at the data from cluster 15 to make sure that there is no inappropriate behavior. And we've also identified this pathway for this new requirement for load serving entities to opt into the load serving entity allocation process. And that really is intended to go as far as the ISO can go to provide increased transparency and rigor to the process without overstepping our jurisdictional authority. But we do think that will lend some credibility and transparency to the process to make sure that the interconnection customers know what load serving entities are looking for in their processes. We've also committed to exploring opportunities for increased non-LSE participation in cluster 16. This is something that I think we need to better understand. I think we've heard from a lot of stakeholders, including interconnection customers and commercial entities, that there are real transactions happening with non-LSEs early in the process. There are PPAs being signed. We want to understand that a little bit better, and we want to also understand how non-load serving entities can participate and coordinate with load serving entities and potentially use the process that we have right now to make sure that the projects that they're interested in are moving forward toward the selection and the study process. But we will also look at potential changes to limitations on the non-load serving entity participation. Right now, it's limited to one project per non-LSE. And so as we see the data come in and we see the results of cluster 15 selections, we can look at that and consider changes. We've also made minor clarifications to various elements of the scoring process, just around the engineering design plan and long lead time resources and things like that, that are clarified in the final addendum. And we've committed also to monitoring the treatment of energy only resources. This is an area where we have not seen a lot of interest historically, but we know that Public Utility Commission portfolios do have more energy only resources in them going forward. And we want to make sure that we're creating a pathway for those projects to interconnect, but also make sure that that pathway is fair and reasonable for us. And as Neil mentioned in his opening remarks, we do intend to make several components of the interconnection request intake process severable in our FERC filing. So Lastly, I just want to acknowledge the staff and the stakeholder time that has been invested in this initiative. It has been a massive effort. I know it's been many late nights for the ISO staff, and I've received many late night emails from stakeholders as well. So we really do appreciate the engagement. And we think that transformational change is really critical to adapting to this increased demand and competition for new generation. We are seeing this right now with Cluster 14, and we're seeing the importance of this transformational change. We know that we can't continue on the path that we're on, and we know that FERC Order 2023 will have some impact and some benefits to us, but it's also not sufficient for the level of change that we need. So the final proposal prioritizes alignment with state and local resource plans, transmission availability, procurement readiness, and it does so in a fair and transparent manner that respects jurisdictional boundaries. Our queue management reforms are absolutely necessary to keep projects moving forward toward commercial operations and to give the ISO the ability to withdraw stagnant projects. And we know that action is critical to address this challenge. The California ISO was at the forefront of the cluster process over a decade ago, and we find ourselves once again on the leading edge of interconnection reform today. We need transformational change if we want to reliably and affordably transition the electric system. And with that, I'll answer any questions that you have.
Wow, I feel like we should all take a breath. Congratulations, Danielle. That was an excellent presentation, a very thorough overview of a very complex topic. So I really appreciate that. Let me tell you how I'm going to divide up our opportunity to have a discussion here. I think what we'll do, if it's okay with the other board members, is if you have questions on the proposal for Danielle, we'll do those first. Then we'll go to public comment to let anyone who would like to make public comments to us on the proposal. And then we'll have a final discussion for board members to offer comments themselves on where we should go with all of this. So if you want to, anybody has any questions for Danielle, I'm looking to see if there's any little hands up, but I'm going to go ahead. Okay, Joe, but let me ask one quick one, Danielle, because this is probably an easier one. Could you give us some sense of the schedule going forward, assuming we move this proposal, which I don't want to prejudge the board's action later, but just give us some sense of the schedule in terms of how this all works, especially with respect to Cluster 15?
Yes, so the intent is to file these changes with FERC in July. Again, I don't want to prejudge your decision either. But that is the current plan, and we would intend to seek either 90 or 120 days for a response from FERC so that we could get underway with Cluster 15 reforms under this new process by October 1st of 2024.
Okay, thank you very much. Joe, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a very minor clarifying question. It has to do with LSE sponsored projects. And with respect to Cluster 15, that list of projects is already set. So to the extent that incentives one way or the other might be provided for more or less LSE sponsored projects, that would really only apply to Cluster 16 going forward. Is that correct?
I think that's partially true. The one clarification I would make is that, well, yes, the list of interconnection requests is set for Cluster 15. They have not been scored with LSE interest. And so we will watch how load serving entities score and rank their own projects relative to other projects as they move forward into the process. And the main thing that we'll be watching for is just ensuring those limitations are held by the load serving entities.
But the LSEs have already spoken with respect to which projects they would sponsor themselves, not prefer.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I'm studying my screen here and I have an elbow, but that's about, I can't tell. Oh, there we go. Severin's got a hand up. Go ahead, Severin.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for a great presentation, Danielle. I want to go back to the LSE point allocation or megawatt allocation and the 150% study limit. and just make sure I understand this. The way this works is the LSE, correct me if I'm wrong, the LSE megawatt allocation is going to be pro rata on their load and is going to go up to 50% of the available transmission capacity, available and planned transmission capacity. But the study, when done, will admit 150% of the available and planned transmission capacity. So, and I think you said this, the anticipation is there will be quite a few projects that get no LSE megawatt or point allocation, but are still part of the study. Was there something in there that wasn't correct?
That was accurate.
Great. So I'm trying to sort of think through how these rankings will work. And it seems like if there will be quite a few projects that get in with no LSE megawatt allocation, that although it will possibly push some into the study that who otherwise wouldn't be, it's certainly not going to be the only, and if it's a small enough share, even possibly the primary factor, though I could imagine the LSEs using their allocation strategically, not for the very best projects, which they know will get accepted anyway, but for ones that on the margin they want to push in because they think they're particularly valuable to them. I guess I shouldn't ask you to speculate on the strategies of each bidder, but so maybe we'll just take that as a statement rather than unless you see something obviously wrong with that reasoning.
No, I think that's a good statement.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Severin. Any other questions or clarifications of the staff from board members at this point? I don't see any hands at the moment. You'll have another opportunity to speak up a little bit later, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to our call host, Silas, if you could go ahead and line people up that would like to make comments to us.
If you would like to make a public comment, please press the raise hand icon on Zoom, or if you are dialed into our phone line, you can press #2 to enter the comment queue. We do have a handful of comments in the queue, starting with Jared Ferguson. You've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. All right. I'm Jared Ferguson with the California Public Utilities Commission Integrated Resource Planning Team. And I'd like to thank Chair Shorey and the board for the opportunity to speak at today's meeting. I want to reiterate what was submitted in a letter from CPUC President Reynolds a few weeks ago. We overall support the proposed reform and appreciate their connection to the 2022 Memorandum of Understanding between the CPUC, Energy Commission, and ISO. We appreciate their planned role in better informing market participants, strengthening the alignment of resource and transmission planning with the interconnection process, and helping to accelerate development and deployment of critical energy resources. CPUC staff again thank the ISO and ISO staff for their hard work and greatly appreciate their continued engagement of stakeholders in this over a year-long effort to develop this proposal. I want to highlight our strong support for the proposal to engage load-serving entities, LSEs, to indicate interest in projects, which this proposal includes appropriate limits to the weight and impact of this interest. We also appreciate the changes to the proposals that the ISO staff have made over the last few weeks to clarify this process and to add transparency. Finally, to better align with the reforms in the proposal, the CPUC will seek to provide clear direction to LSEs in their procurement efforts. Generally, the PUC seeks to only prescribe the resource attributes and the resource attributes required to meet identified procurement needs, but we would also seek to provide, to the extent appropriate, the information necessary for LSEs to focus energy procurement in key transmission zones in alignment with the transmission plan. We would also seek to encourage and support LSE's participation in providing their commercial interests into the interconnection process. I want to thank again the ISO for the hard work that their staff have put into developing this proposal, and thank you for letting me speak today.
Thank you, Jared. That was a very helpful clarification, and we appreciate those comments. And we do have your Chair Reynolds' letter as part of our record of decision. So thank you for that input. Does anybody have any of the board members have any questions for Jared at this point? Okay, thanks very much. Next.
Moving to the next comment in queue, Don Trethaway, you're sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Good morning, Don Trethaway from GDS Associates on behalf of the California Energy Storage Alliance. CESA does remain concerned with the overweighting of the LSC interest in the scoring criteria. As a result, we're very supportive of CAISO filing the various design elements as severable at FERC. However, it's a little unclear to us in terms of how CAISO is going to sort of divide up the various design elements. For example, is the entire scoring criteria going to be severable, or is just the commercial viability portion going to be severable, and you would keep the remainder of the scoring criteria? So any feedback CAISO could give on that would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Trethaway. Danielle, or I don't know if Bill is on the line today from our legal staff. Would anyone like to respond to that?
It's Neil here with the ISO.
Oh, Neil. Okay.
Yes, I'll jump in with the first comment, but I'll also look to see if Danielle or Bill Weaver want to augment. At this point, we have not worked out the exact filing strategy yet for how we will go through this. This is uncharted territory for this type of proposal. So those are details we will be working out as we develop our tariff filing.
Anyone else from the staff? Okay, thank you very much. Next up.
Next, Melissa Alfano, you're sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right? I'll just assume yes.
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 Thank you. My name is Melissa Alfano. I am from the Solar Energy Industries Association. I want to, first of all, thank the board for the opportunity for letting me speak. I also want to thank CAISO staff for the work put into it and the stakeholder engagement. But I do want to raise a couple of points. I'm going to keep this brief because a lot of what SEIA has to say, we've said in our comments and even in our most recent board letter. But I do want to reiterate a couple of points. We, like the ISO, are committed to solutions that improve interconnection efficiency. It is so important to us and our members that projects get online in a efficient manner. But our concern with this particular proposal is filing it in July as is will actually set things a little bit back. I think some of those concerns might be resolved by filing the proposal severable, but with the scoring criteria, if you were to go ahead and file in July as is, we are set back by 90 days waiting on FERC to issue an order. If it doesn't issue a deficiency letter in the meantime, pushing back that 90 days even further. And then facing what will be an uphill battle at FERC. I think many of the comments in this record reflect that. There is some substantial concerns by developers with this particular proposal. There is some concern that it might not be consistent with FERC precedent, even as recently as the MISO reforms that were filed back earlier this year. So we do have significant concerns, and we have concerns that things will be set back. So with that, we do reiterate many of the concerns that we raised in our letter, and we really urge you to not move forward with the scoring criteria as is, to send it back to the stakeholder process and to figure out what can be done to file something that will receive full support from the stakeholder community. I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak this morning.
Thank you, Melissa. And we do have your prior comments as part of the record. We did receive that. And thank you for your comments today. Are there any questions from any of the board members for Melissa? Severin.
Yeah, Melissa, thank you for your comment. I'm understanding what you're opposed to. Can you tell us what you're in favor of as an alternative? I'm trying to understand, assuming that something has to move forward now, what would you propose? And briefly, just as a sketch.
So that it is kind of a hard question for me to answer without potentially rubbing people the wrong way. But I think if you did want to move forward with the scoring proposal, I think one of the biggest concerns is the lack of allocation to the non-load serving entities, so the large buyers. There's been concern that that quote can't be defined. We believe that it actually can be defined, and it has been defined in the tariff PD allocations. Additionally, like you mentioned just a few minutes ago, in response to staff's presentation, we do have concern about that LSE interest, right? So like you said, there is the ability for the LSEs to then withhold some things and strategically push forward the less efficient projects. So having clear guidelines around that, but at this point, it's difficult to see how that can be consistent with the jurisdictional boundaries.
Okay, I just want to be clear. I didn't say that they would strategically push forward less efficient projects. I said that they might strategically choose one project and possibly for more efficient reasons. But I appreciate your comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. Any other questions from the board? Okay, next up.
Next, Susan Schneider, you're sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Oh, hi. Yes, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I'm speaking on behalf of the Large Scale Solar Association. And as I have before, I'll ask a small indulgence regarding the 3-minute rule. I'll try speaking quickly, but LSA has many members that account for much of the generation and storage development in the state, and we've tried to consolidate our comments to save time today. So our comments will hit the high points of our latest letter to the board. LSA urges the CAISO board to direct management to make 3 changes to the proposal. First, reconsider the proposed framework applicability to Cluster 15 if the recent TPD allocation process results in fewer no TPD zones. The second request is to modify the scoring rubric application to mixed fuel resources. And the third is to reduce the weight of the commercial interest category applied to Cluster 15 projects if that category is retained. And I'm going to address each point with just a little bit more detail quickly. First, the zonal issue. And I do recall that Governor Leslie had asked management to address this issue at the last meeting, and we did not see anything about that, about this consideration in either the final addendum or in the presentation today. But as described in detail in our letter, the rules that would apply in the so-called TPD zones, transmission plan deliverability zones, are similar to the current option A rules which have been selected by probably 99% plus of current projects. The merchant deliverability zone rules, by contrast, are very similar to the current option B rules that have been proven non-viable in the last 20 years, only they would be even more costly and risky under this proposal. As far as we know, not a single project has ever reached COD under option B. The reasonable TPD zone rules will apply only where there's available deliverability. Now, the TPD allocation zone process is complete for this, or TPD allocation process is complete for this year. And there may be little or no deliverability left in any zone after Cluster 14 participation this cycle. Now, the CAISO report on the overall TPD allocation results, which will tell us whether there will be any TPD zones, will be out in just a few days. So we don't understand the rush to judgment before this critical information is available. If most of all of cluster 15 has to follow onerous and non-viable merchant deliverability rules, we have to seriously consider whether the loss of all or nearly all cluster 15 projects will leave us with a sufficient number and mix of projects to achieve the state's goals. We have not had that conversation, and it is sorely needed. As a side point, if there are few or no TPD zones, the scoring rubric, which applies to projects seeking deliverability only in those zones, would apply to few or no cluster 15 projects anyway. So given in agreement with the prior speaker, so the CAISO might as well take the extra time we think is needed to iron out the remaining problems with the scoring rubric and not file it now if it's not actually really going to be used if it's going to be used little or not at all. And that brings us to the scoring rubric, where we have two substantive comments, assuming it is actually going to apply anywhere in the CAISO footprint. The first concerns the treatment of mixed fuel resources. Now, solar plus storage mixed fuel resources are the predominant fuel type in cluster 15, and the current scoring flaws then can have a real impact on what the results and the projects that are accepted for study. Now, it's important to remember that this entire framework is based on available deliverability. The zonal classifications are based on available deliverability by zone. The amount of capacity accepted for study is based on available deliverability in those areas. And the LSE interest point allocations are based on available deliverability. However, the scoring for mixed fuel resources is based on interconnection service capacity, not how much deliverability each project is seeking. So a 100 megawatt solar plus storage project seeking deliverability for 50 megawatts of storage and 100 megawatt solar plus storage project seeking deliverability for 100 megawatts of storage would be treated exactly the same. Both projects have to get 100 megawatts of LSE interest points for full credit in the commercial interest category, even though the first project only needs half the deliverability. And similarly, a 100 megawatt standalone storage project only needs 100 LSE interest points to get full credit in that category, while a mixed fuel resource seeking 100 megawatts of storage deliverability coupled with 200 megawatts of energy-only solar capacity needs 200 LSE interest points. This plan simply makes no sense and should be changed to rely on deliverability sought instead of POI capacity. Instead of treating rules, and in general, instead of treating rules applicable to mixed fuel resources as an afterthought addressed through one addendum after the other, the CAISO really should sit down and rationalize this important part of the proposal. Finally, while we appreciate the CAISO's attempt to add transparency to the LSE interest point system, the CAISO should acknowledge that this system cannot work as envisioned for cluster 15, even if it may be feasible later. The proposed system relies heavily on communication and processes before interconnection requests are submitted, and that simply did not happen and cannot happen for cluster 15 projects whose applications were submitted a year ago. There's no way to hold LSEs accountable for following any criteria they may set forth. In fact, nearly all formal procurement RFOs leave an out for the issuing load serving entity to deviate from the stated selection criteria, and these are not formal RFOs. The LSE points allocation will not be public, so there's no way to know if LSE selections follow the stated criteria, including whether they allocate most or all their points to their own projects, which the rules allow them to do. And at a minimum, if the CAISO retains this after the fact cobbled together feature for cluster 15, then it should significantly reduce the points weighting for this initial application. If the system really does work well, the points weighting can always be increased for future clusters, and if not, the damage to cluster 15 will have been limited. So that's the sum total of our comments at this point, and I would be happy to address any questions the board members may have.
Thank you very much, Susan, for those comments, and we do have your prior correspondence as part of the record and have had a chance to review it. Excuse me. Do any board members have any questions or clarifications from Susan?
I guess
No,
I
but
would like to.
Sorry, I would like to hear if staff has a response. And thank you, Susan, for your comments. They were very useful and very enlightening, and specifically focusing. I am worried about cluster 15 resulting in not enough resources for us to meet our state goals. If that is a possibility and how the ISO feels about that, that would be important for us to see. And then the kerfuffle with the dual fuel storage and solar resources as well. Can you please address that?
Yes, happy to. So I want to direct Susan to the board memo as well, which specifically addresses a lot of these concerns. In particular around the impacts of cluster 14 on cluster 15. The ISO does acknowledge that it is a possibility that available transmission capacity will be significantly reduced for cluster 15. We are not concerned, however, that will have an impact on our ability to achieve our resource portfolios because we are studying 150% of the available transmission capacity. So that 150% number is really critical to ensuring that we'll study sufficient resources to align with our resource portfolios and to align with the available transmission that we have both available and planned. The reason that it's a percentage rather than a megawatt number or a number of interconnection requests is exactly that. It's to make sure that we have a sufficient pool of resources in the study process that are current and ready and have load serving entity interest so that once they're studied, they have a smoother path to commercial offtake.
I wonder, would it be possible for me to respond?
Let the staff go ahead, please, and
Okay,
finish
sorry.
responding to the board question first.
Okay, sorry about that.
In response to the mixed fuel resources issue, we did provide some clarity in the addenda. We promptly revised the first addenda in response to the conversations that we had with stakeholders on this issue on May 16th. We had heard overwhelmingly a need to address this issue by looking at the interconnection service capacity. And so that's what we've proposed. We did also seek clarifications around the energy only components of a mixed fuel resource or a solar plus storage hybrid or co-located resource to state that to the extent a project has any energy only capacity, it won't be treated, if it has any deliverability at all, it will not be treated as an energy only resource. It should be treated as a partial capacity delivery status resource, PCDS resource. So that way it will be able to apply for the amount of deliverability that it seeks when you look at the project as a whole.
Good, thank you, Danielle. And so Susan, my only caution to you is this isn't a debate, but if there's an additional informational comment you'd like to make, go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. I do appreciate your indulgence. On the issue of the setting of 100% available capacity, if there are zones with no available capacity, 100% of 50% of that is zero. And the scoring rubric, in fact, will not even apply. And all projects can be studied, but they have to fund very expensive and very risky upgrades in order to even be accepted. So that doesn't really address the issue. And there has been clarity on the energy only, the mixed fuel resources. It used to be worse. If you had 100 megawatts of solar and 50 megawatts of storage, you used to have to get 150 megawatts of points to get full credit. Now you only have to get 100 megawatts, which is usually POI capacity for that. But still, if you only are seeking 50 megawatts of deliverability, you shouldn't have to get 100 megawatts of points in order to get the full credit. So those are my only responses. But thank you very much, Governor Shorey.
Great. Thank you very much for those additional comments. Mary, I apologize. I cannot tell if you have a hand up or not. So did you have anything you wanted to say? Yes.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Just to that last point that Susan made, can staff address that, the point requirement?
Okay, good. Any other questions for Susan? Great. Well, thank you very much for those thorough comments, Susan, and let's move on to the next person.
But wait, Jan, can the staff address Susan's last point about?
Oh, yes. Excuse me, I should have said
about
that.
the difference in scoring.
Right.
Her last point. Okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Danielle.
So projects will be awarded points based on the capacity, based on the percentage of capacity that an LSE awards to the project. And so we're asking the interconnection customers to have their points be based on the amount of deliverability that they are seeking. And that's what will be used to evaluate the percentage of capacity that's allocated to them by the LSEs.
Anything else from any member of the board on this topic?
Does that satisfy Susan's question?
I don't know if Susan's still.
Susan, you're still unmuted. You can go ahead.
Am I unmuted? I'm so sorry. Okay. I don't know. I don't believe it satisfies the question because you still have to, in order to get full credit, you have to get the interconnection points equal to the interconnection service capacity and not just deliverability, unless there's been a further change since the last addendum that has not been included in anything yet.
I don't think there are any additional changes. I think we're working with what's in front of the board today.
So then Danielle, would we acknowledge that there is that gap that Susan's pointing out?
Yeah, I think this is something that we can continue to communicate and work on with stakeholders. It's a relatively, it seems like an addressable issue. And it's really only regarding the point allocation, and it won't impact deliverability or anything like that. So I think it is something that we can clear up offline, and we can commit to doing that.
That would be great, because it does affect their ability to score and be accepted. So it's a fair point by them.
Good. Thank you very much,
Thank
Mary and Danielle. And Susan, thank you for that discussion. Okay, next up.
Next, Jeffrey Nelson, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead. Jeffrey Nelson, you're unmuted. You can go ahead. Jeffrey, we're not getting any audio from your line. You may need to check your microphone settings on the drop down by your mute button. Until that gets sorted, we can come back to Jeffrey Nelson. For now, Bryn Baker, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. Bryn Baker, Senior Director of Policy at the Clean Energy Buyers Association, that represents commercial, industrial, and institutional energy customers, many of which have significant operations in the CAISO territory. I just wanted to reiterate, we are broadly supportive of all of the factors CAISO is trying to balance here, and thank you for the chance to comment today. Just 3 quick points. First is speed to market is a critical common goal. And so we remain concerned in light of that the proposal does not take full advantage of how corporate offtake can provide project financing that helps make these projects more viable. Corporate offtake fundamentally de-risks projects earlier in the development cycle. So recognizing corporate offtake can help speed these projects available for RA. We do believe that prioritizing a project with corporate offtake at the same level, or perhaps even higher, as one with an LSE expression of interest, which is itself not financeable, can actually help advance more projects and ultimately make more RA available to the LSEs. So we remain concerned that scoring projects with LSE expressions of interest significantly above those with actual PPAs with non-LSEs fails to provide a useful metric for commercial viability. So lastly, corporate offtake does work through their LSE, but there is an opportunity to outline criteria, I think as a previous speaker mentioned, that could allow projects with these investment grade corporate off-takers to more directly qualify for points, recognizing these projects have greater commercial viability. The current approach may actually risk reducing the amount of RA that is eventually available to LSEs. So we certainly look forward to continue to work with the CAISO and team around the details of how projects ultimately get financed and how the approach could potentially be amended going forward. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Bryn. Let me ask you just a quick question. Well, first off, let's start with the idea that your members are providing a very valuable service, and I think that the board understands that in accelerating and improving the viability of the commercial viability of projects and bringing them to market. But my other understanding is that your members do not count. I'm trying to think of a better way to describe that for purposes of the state's analysis of resource adequacy, that only load serving entities, when we attempt to analyze the needs of the state going forward and determine how much we need and by when, that your members are actually still pretty much counted. I guess I'll say their load is counted as part of LSE analysis that's being done at the Energy Commission and at the PUC. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the crux of the issue is that in some ways there's no such thing as a non-LSE project. Corporates work with their LSEs on commercial development. Right. They have to. And so they're in the development cycle, corporate offtake is de-risking these assets earlier in the cycle. So I think our thought going forward is recognizing projects that have a corporate offtake could potentially qualify for more points within even the LSE allocation.
Got it. But my understanding in the staff proposal is the corporate off-takers are getting points. They just aren't getting as many as an LSE.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the board members for Bryn? Thank you very much, Bryn. Okay. Next up, well, maybe we can try Jeff Nelson again and see if his audio came back.
Jeff Nelson, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead. Okay, Jeff, I see that your line is unmuted. If you are speaking, we can't hear you. Jeff, through the chat, I'm going to send you instructions to call in so that we can hear your comment via the phone.
Good. Thank you very much for your help with this. Technology is always great until it's not. So I appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and keep forging forward. So next up.
Next up, we've got Matthew Plummer in the queue. Matthew, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I'll be brief. PG&E continues to support the Track 2 interconnection reforms and encourages the board to adopt them today. We also want to thank staff for their exceptional engagement with stakeholders, including the latest round of engagement after the May board meeting. Please vote yes today.
Great. Thank you for those succinct comments. We appreciate it. Right. Next up.
Next up is Shane O'Brien in the queue. Shane, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate the opportunity from the board to provide comments on this CAISO proposal. While we do support many aspects of the proposal, I'd like to build on some of the comments that Susan provided earlier and provide a different but aligned perspective with the zonal screening process. As we provided during the May meeting and in written comments, we are concerned with this discontinuity in the proposed screening process that seeks to use deliverable capacity available today that will not be available to these projects when they seek TPD 3 years in the future when they are eligible under the proposed process. CAISO has acknowledged that this deliverable capacity will be reduced by higher queued projects and that any new deliverable capacity created through the CPUC siting process during this 3-year study process will not align with the projects that were screened 3 years in the past. This discontinuity increases speculation in the interconnection process by only allowing projects to participate if capacity is available today when the screened projects are not yet eligible for this capacity. We are concerned that years of effort and tens of millions of dollars of developer study deposits, as they directly fund this work, will be wasted. This aspect of the proposal does not align with CAISO's stated values to provide more certainty and a more effective process. We've provided additional suggestions to modify other components of the process to allow for the zonal screening process to have more value, which have not been incorporated into the proposal. We do not agree with CAISO's comments that acknowledge this problem, but fail to recognize that TPD being awarded today is based on CPUC work that was done years in the past, and that the projects would have been screened out in the past as well. On a looking forward basis, this does not provide value to the current projects being screened and studied to be aligned with the CPUC work that would be aligned with this specific group of projects' eligibility to seek TPD. We appreciate the board's time and consideration of these comments.
Thank you very much, Shane. Are there any questions from board members?
I guess I would like to hear staff response to this suggestion of a mismatch in the timing.
I would just note that there are over 500 gigawatts in the current queue right now that are competing for, deliverability and for offtake agreements. Yes, there is, kind of a constantly moving, shifting time frame with the CPUC portfolios and with the transmission plans. But I think load serving entity engagement in the process right now will help us kind of smooth that time frame out by having the load serving entities look at their procurement needs in the future and align the projects that they are going to need with the study process to ensure that we're studying the projects that we anticipate and plan for. So I might be missing some of the nuance of the comments, but I think we've accounted for the process and done our best to ensure that there is alignment with the planning and that we are looking several years out, because as we know, transmission lead times are quite long as well. And we need resources to come in and develop in order to align with those timeframes.
Shane,
I
could you
assume-
give us, explain what your alternative is to using the CPUC information?
We did provide a few different alternatives. I mean, really what we're looking for is an alignment with the capacity that's being used, the capacity amount that's being used for the screening process to be locked or, contained with a specific group of projects so that it can be consistent throughout the whole process. This is similar to how other ISOs effectuate their policy and economic expansion portfolios with a specific group of interconnection cluster projects. The way they do this is they would only include those network upgrades that are providing the additional deliverable capacity and associating that with a specific queue cluster so that you don't have this discontinuity between the models, the amount of capacity that's being evaluated at the front end of the process being different than the available capacity that's being available and studied at the end of the process.
Yeah, I can see a trade-off, though, that on the one hand, you get more certainty, and on the other hand, you get poorer information because new information becomes available that you then ignore because you have locked the capacity for that cluster.
I understand your comments. We're concerned on the other side of this that you're effectively locked in or locked out to certain areas that may or may not actually have deliverable capacity when the time comes in the study process, because there isn't a continuity there.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time. Thank you.
Thanks, Severin, and thank you, Shane. Any other questions from the board?
I just wanted to point out that we heard from the CPUC, we've had the letter from President Reynolds, and the alignment between CAISO and CPUC is going to be improving and evolving over time. So that gives me a comfort level that this process is going to continuously improve, just like we try and strive to continuously improve all processes to achieve better outcomes. So it gives me comfort that CAISO, CEC, and CPUC are much better aligned, and that process will continue to improve.
Good. Thank you, Angelina. Okay, I don't know if we want to go back to Jeff Nelson if he's been able to call in.
Yep, Jeff is over on the phone line. I'm unmuting him now.
Perfect. Hi, Jeff. We've been waiting for you.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So first, I'd like to thank you for showing such grace and patience as I tried to work through the technology issues. And in addition, we really do appreciate all of the work that's gone in from the ISO staff and the whole stakeholder community on this very important process we've got in front of us. SCE encourages the board to approve the proposal. It supports California clean energy goals. And as was already noted, and something that I won't say keep me awake at night, but I do think about it, we have to build about 7,000 megawatts of new generation every year for the next 2 decades to reach our 2045 goals. And we view this as an important step towards processes that will allow that sort of upscaling of infrastructure build out to happen. So it's an important proposal. We do encourage the board to approve it. The current process must be reformed. It just can't work as is. It's bogging things up with inviable projects and studies that are producing sort of nonsensical results because of the stuff that's never going to come to fruition that are being studied. We also think it's important for the commercial viability aspects of this, focusing on resources that really have a fighting chance of moving from concept to actual steel in the ground. And along these lines, we very strongly support the LSC point allocation as a way for those buying the power to show interest and support of commercial viability. We think it's a very important process. We understand the transparency concerns. We want to note that at least the PUC regulated entities have a significant regulatory oversight over what we procure, and if we're going to do any self-build, anything we would self-build, it would only be under sort of instructions. We have multiple layers of review and transparency already in our procurement process. And we often have the independent third-party evaluators that are also brought into the process. So we support the transparency that's being proposed, but we just like to say that we have a lot more than just what's being proposed as part of our normal processes. So we do like to thank everyone for the work on this, especially the ISO staff. It's very comprehensive, it's complex, but it's a major step forward. And I personally think that there will be definitely needs, revisions and tweaking and stuff as we move on and see how things work. So this is a huge step forward that we really think needs to get rolling. So in conclusion, we support this. We think it's well-balanced, comprehensive, provides much needed reform, and we strongly encourage the board to approve the proposal. And with that, thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for those comments. Do any of the board members have comments or questions for Jeff? Okay, thanks very much. And thank you, Jeff. Then we'll go on to the next person.
Next, Sarah Fitzsimon, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Hello, Sarah Fitzsimon on behalf of the Independent Energy Producers Association. Thank you, Chair and Governors, for taking this call. So I'd like to start off by being very appreciative of the ISO staff for working with us, our members, and other stakeholders on amendments to these proposals throughout the last year. I do want to recognize that a lot of work has gone into adding some of our recommendations into this final proposal. We certainly recognize that and appreciate it. We do have one remaining concern, really. I know it's been mentioned before in relation to the commercial interest aspect of the 3 LSC self-build projects. That concern still remains. We just don't want there to be an undermining of the competitive procurement process. And I'd heard Governor Bornstein had asked, what are some alternatives? So IEP is looking for perhaps going back to the draft final proposal. There was the draft and then there was the draft final proposal. So going back to the draft where it had the initial 1 self-build LSE project with a review coming through after the clusters 15 and 16 to determine if more are needed. But I know if that's not really on the table for a vote today, and perhaps this 3 self-build projects remain within the vote today, we do still think that there should be a review of the data around utility self-build projects within clusters 15 and 16 and look to see if we need to move back to 1 self-build would be better off to maintain the competitive process. So we do appreciate the time that has been spent on working with us on these comments and our members' comments and the opportunity to have more comment today.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. Severin.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Can you explain, is the concern more about the IOUs, munis, or CCAs, or what? I'm trying to understand, because the IOUs are heavily regulated in a pretty public way by the CPUC, and I'm trying to understand if the view is that that's just not an adequate regulation to get an outcome that's best for the consumers, which is what the goal is, or if you think that the muni process is flawed, or CCAs. I guess I'm not clear what the problem is.
Hard-hitting questions today. To make sure I don't say anything that would be ill-advised. I believe that our concern really is, I would say mostly with IOU self-build projects. I do understand, as Danielle had mentioned earlier, that the 3 self-build, the jump from 1 to 3 within the draft and the final was based off of historical cluster data. We do understand that. We just anticipate a lot more projects need to be built, and the opportunity for more LSCs to actually put forward self-build projects will be a lot more frequent than before. And so we're just trying to maintain caution around competitiveness. I don't really want to speak to like which type of entity is really getting the upper hand here in particular. We just want to make sure that there's a type of competitiveness maintained so that the projects that are come online are getting the right type of scoring criteria and they're being prioritized. Also noting that the commercial interest category is still a large percentage of the scoring criteria in general. So it just is really leaning towards LSE interests rather than making it a little bit more neutral. I think if you would like more detail to that, I would be able to respond in writing later on. So if that's not sufficient, I would be happy to add more commentary.
Well, I think we're going to have to make a decision today, but yeah, I would like to continue the discussion, maybe just in a meeting to understand what the concern is. Thanks.
Well, and I will just add that as Sarah was mentioning, we do have the opportunity to monitor this as we go forward and see what we end up with. And as Angelina pointed out, these proposals have some flexibility and we will try to continuously improve them. So thank you for your comments today, Sarah. That was very helpful, that discussion. Okay, next up.
I just have a very quick comment, Jeff.
Oh, sorry.
I know my hand is kind of hard to
see. I can
see.
never see your hand.
I have to change the color.
I needed to go on the blue side of your screen. Go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to very quickly see if Danielle O'Neill or someone had a response towards that perceived bias towards LSE projects. And we did hear from Jeff Nelson, and Jeff Nelson did point out that there is transparency and scrutiny, and that there is a requirement for even-handedness within the LSE framework as well. But what extra steps are we taking to alleviate that concern? Because we've heard it a few times, and again, as Jen pointed out, and I said before, this is an evolving process. We'll continue to improve. But in the meantime, what's the update?
Yeah, well, I would emphasize Jan's point about the need to continue to monitor this first. That is something that we will continue to watch. I also want to highlight the PUC's comments on this too, as it relates to their willingness to continue to exercise their oversight on the procurement process. So after the scoring process, looking at and scrutinizing utility-owned contracts against other contracts and making sure that those were selected in a fair and transparent manner. I think those are really two important elements of it. And then, I think the speakers were accurate in how they characterized our intent in this proposal. We did not want to do anything that was going to open the floodgates to only utility-owned generation, and at the same time didn't want to do anything that was going to discourage or prevent it either, because there is an allowance for utility-owned or LSE-sponsored generation that isn't our role to adjust right now. So we've really tried to strike a balance with this, but certainly we'll continue to monitor it.
Great.
May I just comment really quick on that? I just want to say I do appreciate, we were not stating that there was a bias. We do understand the reasoning as to how you went up to 3 self-builds based off of historical data, and I do appreciate the extra explanation. I just don't want to be on record noting that there was a bias, just that it had ended up being 3 self-builds. So thank you for that extra comment and opportunity to comment.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Angelina, did you have more?
Oh, good. So there's no bias. That's great. I thought I heard different. Okay. Well, no, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for clarifying this, Danielle. And as long as we're meeting the 7,000 megawatts goal a year, and we're studying the projects that have the greatest viability and allow for reliability, resilience, efficiency, and cost-effective delivery of the resources we need, then we're moving in the right direction, with always room to improve, which we'll strive to do.
Great. Thank you, Angelina. Any other comments from the board? Okay, on to the next person.
Next, Ryan Millard, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Good morning, board members. This is Ryan Millard. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Ryan Millard, NextEra Energy Resources. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this proposal this morning. Many developers have already highlighted their concerns that the scoring criteria are rooted in significant potential for a lack of transparency, unjust discrimination against non-LSE developers with viable projects, and infringement upon principles of open access. They've also highlighted instances of LSEs seeking concessions from developers in exchange for early points allocation, which demonstrates a clear risk of exploitation. NextEra shares these concerns, and I'd like to offer a practical example for the board's consideration this morning. Recently, one LSE has indicated to NextEra that they are running an RFP soon that includes Cluster 15 projects, And to secure LSE point allocations, developers will need to grant a right of first offer to them and submit a $5 per kilowatt deposit to secure that right of first offer. So to put that into context for you, if you were to apply this to a 300 megawatt storage project, that's a $1.5 million deposit that we would need to post 10 years before expected COD just to enter the queue. That's untenable, even for some of the largest Western developers. While we appreciate CAISO's desire not to propose a prescriptive RFI process for LSEs, the absence of minimum standards introduces too much potential inequity to this process, and it's unclear whether and how LRAs will be safeguarding against practices that would ultimately compromise the ability for this process to remain fair and competitive. NextEra supports and appreciates the CAISO's proposal to include severable element treatment of these controversial intake screening issues, but we'd strongly urge the CAISO to devote more time to refining this element of the proposal for potential future application to Cluster 15 projects. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Could I ask the staff to, and I don't know if this is a question then for the legal staff or for you, Danielle or Neil, to respond to the comments that were made about the LSE that is seeking a right of first offer plus a deposit?
Sure, I'm happy to respond. So the first point I would make is that this is a two-way street, right? These are negotiations and conversations that we are trying to encourage to some extent between interconnection customers and load serving entities. The ISO is not in a position where we can set minimum standards for procurement or these types of contract negotiations. Those really do fall under the purview of the Public Utilities Commission and local regulatory authorities. And, you know, it's incumbent on the interconnection customers to evaluate their tolerance for that level of risk and that level of cost at this point in the process, and the need to continue to move forward with an offer like that or with a condition like that. I think the ISO has, and I don't know if legal wants to opine on this as well, but I think the ISO has gone really as far as we possibly can in providing requirements for transparency and fairness in the process, while still leaving that really under the individual LRAs and CPUC's jurisdiction and control. And that's really important to us. We absolutely want this process to be fair and transparent. We're not looking to increase costs on project development. In fact, we think that there is some opportunity that earlier competition in this process can actually reduce the costs of projects as they move forward and result in ratepayer benefits. So, you know, I think it's really important that developers continue to raise concerns with offers like that with the LSEs and have those conversations with them. If escalations are necessary, I think they take those through the load serving entity and up to that load serving entity's regulatory body. But it's not the ISO's job to enforce procurement.
Thank you, Danielle. Did anybody else on the staff want to make a comment? I have a limited screen, so I can't tell if anyone else has a hand raised. Any other, oh, there's Severin. I do see Severin's. Oh, you're muted.
I think I just didn't put my hand down after the last one, so.
Oh, okay. All right,
Okay,
good.
my hand is
And
still.
there's
invisible.
Angelina's hand again, blending into the ISO building. Sorry, I have a hard time seeing it on my
I
screen.
have to
Go ahead.
change the color. Oh yeah, I know. I guess I am concerned about statements like discriminatory, unjust, unfair. And I understand that the ISO has limited authority to address this. So are we working and raising these issues to a certain extent with the PUC to make sure that the PUC has a process as well? Because the last thing we would want is a pay-to-play perception too, that the only the ones who can pay to participate in the interconnection with the LSEs can participate in that, and that somehow projects that are non-LSE projects are unfairly disadvantaged compared to LSE projects, and then the LSE having projects and running the process too puts it in an interesting position. So I'm just wondering, it probably isn't something we can address now. It's more of a future looking activity for Cluster 15. but do we have a process of coordinating closely with the PUC to make sure that we alleviate these concerns as much as the ISO can do, because this is a process that ultimately reflects on us as well. And fairness across the board is very important. So thank you.
Go ahead, Elliot.
Governor Gliff, I'd like just to speak for all of us at the CAISO. I think Danielle and Neil and others have already spoken to this, but certainly the integrity of the process and the transparency here is critically important to us. And, this feedback has come to us. I think we all know that in any system of rules that you set up, including the existing system, can be subject to untoward behavior. And we've seen examples of that, in different elements, whether it's markets or tariff or current queuing or you name it. We know that there are risks here. We've taken steps both within our tariff and in direct consultation with the leadership of the state and other local regulatory authorities to make sure that their processes are monitored carefully and processed to make sure that we do not see untoward behavior or manipulation of the rules. So it is very, very important to us. I think the emphasis, and also I want to emphasize also, I think the board has made it very clear to us in recent weeks that the integrity and the transparency of this process is absolutely manifold. So it will be incumbent upon the regulatory bodies who have the ultimate jurisdiction to manage these processes, and the individuals in the realm of the load serving organizations to stay within the rules, to not manipulate the processes. And we are going to have to watch carefully. We will stay within our jurisdictional rights and responsibilities, but we will clearly be keeping a very close eye on this set of issues.
Thank you, Elliot. Appreciate that. I know that the ISO is very committed to transparency and inclusion and making sure there's fairness across the board. And we need to continue to communicate that. And of course, watch for any untoward behavior. If it exists, no process is immune to it, but we're doing our best and we'll continue to improve and refine as we always have. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Angelina. Any other board questions or comments? Go ahead, Mary.
Jan, just a quick clarification to Danielle. You said earlier on in the presentation that price is not available till after the project selection is complete. Can you just clarify that?
Sure. At this point in the interconnection process, when developers are still unsure, haven't had their studies completed yet, they don't have a full picture of the cost of the PPA that would result from the project, because they don't have a very large component of that price information, which would be the interconnection cost. So the interconnection cost is essentially why we do the interconnection study. We need the cost information and the timeline information, which come out the other side of the study process. And so for a developer and LSE to negotiate a PPA prior to the interconnection study, that would be questionable, because the cost of the interconnection itself would still be unknown. So there may be some speculative numbers in there or some off-ramps to the PPA or something like that. So we're really trying not to encourage power purchase agreements or agreements on those types of terms this early in the process. We've tried to have the LSE scoring process be indicative of interest and based on interest, but not, not something that's going to encourage final binding power purchase agreements before both entities have the full information that they need.
So to that end, it'd be fair to say that we do not know how competitive an overall project is in terms of its cost effectiveness. That is not part of our job. Our job is to determine the interconnection costs and viability based on our criteria.
Yes, that's accurate.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Mary. I'm sorry, did somebody else have a question? No? I'm looking for little hands. Okay, let's see if we have any more public comment.
Our next comment in the queue is from Meg McNall. Meg, you've been sent a prompt to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Good morning, Chair Shorey and governors. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Meg McNall, and I'm commenting today on behalf of the 6 cities, which comprise the cities of Anaheim, Azusa, spanning Colton, Pasadena, and Riverside, California. We provided a letter in support of the ISO's proposal to the board in advance of last month's meeting, and would just like to briefly weigh in today in support, continuing support for the ISO's proposal, including including the changes reflected in the final addendum. We think this final proposal reflects a reasonable and a balanced approach, and we would encourage the board to approve it, as PG&E and Edison have already articulated this morning. And we'd note the staff's comments in its memo that this is really an initial step in interconnection reform. We have track 3 of the process commencing later this summer, which we understand will deal with issues of deliverability. And finally, I'd like to highlight a topic that has come up already this morning, which is that the ISO has committed to monitoring various aspects of this proposal's implementation. And as LSEs, we are expecting monitoring to ensure transparency, particularly with the implementation of the scoring criteria and the LSE components. So with that, again, reiterating our support and encouraging the board to adopt the proposal today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meg. Any questions from the board members for Meg? Nope. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Next up.
There are no further public comments in queue at this time.
Well, thank you all. That was that probably set some kind of a record, I suspect, and we do appreciate really the extensive involvement of our stakeholders. We know that this process has been ongoing for more than a year, and that we are finally now at the point where we have to make a decision on whether or not to move forward. So with that, as I promised earlier, I'm going to request any of our board members who would like to make some comments before we consider the motion, which is being put up on the board. This is the staff recommended motion, but why don't we open it up for general comments first to the board members? Go ahead. According to, okay, so the order I have right now is Severin and then Joe, and then we'll see if Mary and Angelina. Mary.
First, I want to thank the staff for the incredible work they put in developing this, and for, at least with me, the incredible work they put in meeting with me and answering all my questions. I want to thank all of the participants. This is the most controversial vote that I have taken in the 5.5 years I've been on the board. I have spent a lot of hours reading all the letters and all the background material and meeting with staff and meeting with stakeholders. I am going to vote in favor of this proposal. I realize it is not a perfect proposal, that there are flaws and disagreements about what those flaws are. My own inclination is to tilt more towards an auction format, which it sounds like a few of the stakeholders might think is preferred, but is not widely agreed to be preferred. We may end up defaulting to that in some cases, and it will be interesting to see how that comes out. But, you know, I think the bottom line is we have to make a major change. What we're doing now is not working. And I think that this is a well-reasoned proposal for the next step. It's going to require further adjustments down the line, and maybe they'll be in the direction I'm more inclined to, or maybe I'll figure out that that's not the best direction. But I think that this is a reasonable change to make, and not doing it just is not an alternative at this point. We have to fix what is deeply broken right now. So that's my reasoning. I appreciate all of the meetings I've had with stakeholders and the concerns they have. I have tried to understand them as well as possible, but I think that we have to move forward and then watch this and see how it goes. Thanks.
Thank you, Severin. I saw Joe's hand up next, and then Angelina.
The problem with Seven going first is he says everything that I want to say. So I'm gonna.
Yeah, but we
I'm
each
gonna.
get an opportunity to say it, Joe. So go ahead.
I'm gonna say it again, but perhaps less eloquently. To me, we have no choice but to move forward. Business as usual. FERC Order 2023 notwithstanding, is not viable. We will not do a service to the state of California, to the developers, to the LLCs by continuing with what we have been trying to do with cluster and seek to execute with Cluster 14. So dramatic change is required. I want to thank first the deep engagement by the stakeholders like Seven. I have read all of the comments, not just those coming into this decision, but I've followed many of the stakeholder workshops, watching the videos, reading the comments that came in, seeing how the proposal has evolved. This has been a very, very engaged process, and I want to commend Danielle and Neil and Bob and the staff for managing what is a very, very complex set of issues in a very transparent, open, and very responsive way. I've seen a lot of evolution, not the evolution that some people want, but I've seen a lot of evolution and clarity and a lot of thoughtfulness. I thought the staff memo specifically for today's decision was just an excellent summary of the positions and the rationales for what we want to do. So like Seven, I feel very comfortable supporting this initiative. This is a very thoughtful and balanced approach. You don't take it lightly, the transformative nature of this change, but I think it is absolutely essential that we make a bold step forward. Otherwise, we'll never get out of the hole that we find ourselves in. Most importantly, this is one step, and I've been very, very heartened to hear the commitment by staff, and I know everyone will be watching this very, very closely. I'll be looking for regular updates from staff about how the implementation of this has evolved and looking to fix things more or less in real time to the extent that we can, because I know there will be a need to tweak, but I think we have an excellent starting point, and I feel very, very comfortable with the balance that's been struck. So again, thank you, staff, and thank you to all the stakeholders for your active engagement. This is a much better proposal for your involvement and one that I'm very comfortable supporting. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Angelina?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And I really wanted to acknowledge staff and the ISO and all the hard work that the ISO has put into this. It's an evolutionary process. We've had many interconnection changes over the years. It's always an improvement. We're always on the cutting edge. We're always the ones breaking new ground and have been successful as one of the largest ISOs with more integration of renewables and resources as we meet our state goals and policy goals, ensuring reliability, resiliency, cost effectiveness, value to our customers, and of course, serving as an example to the region and the nation and internationally as well. So I do want to commend the ISO for doing that and for their leadership on local, national, and international scale in terms of interconnecting resources. I also wanted to say that we run a stakeholder process that is probably exemplary across the board, and the engagement of stakeholders is critical. So wanted to thank all stakeholders for their participation, their active engagement throughout the years, and ensuring that this process continues to evolve and continues to serve all to the extent possible and is always adaptable and flexible for additional improvements. So thank you all for your participation and for your comments. And this is exemplified by today's activities as well. We're focused on being well balanced. We're focused on being transparent. We're going to continue to do that. And we're going to engage closely with the regulatory bodies to ensure that we are more closely aligned, and that as it becomes even more difficult to integrate the resources that we need to meet our goals, that we are going to be closer aligned and working on a statewide basis to ensure success. So thank you all for the hard work. This is not an end all. This is just a continuation on the many steps that have been taken and the additional steps that remain for the future. And I look forward to working with all of you to ensure that we continue to be trailblazers as we have. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Angelina. Mary?
Yeah, so I think, Jan, I like to echo my gratitude to the staff and to Elliot's leadership. He's been talking about this for, since practically when he came, about our queue, about how, you know, I think Danielle said in the beginning, we have 500 gigawatts in our potential projects in our queue. I mean, that's like if you combine countries, maybe you would have that many gigawatts, you know. But I think our new reality of needing to integrate 7,000 megawatts a year is also quite important. And I guess I support the current proposal. My issues with it are now a heightened awareness around competitiveness issues, and particularly the interdependent relationship we have regarding cost. Because as a CAISO board member who is currently up for reappointment, I have received many questions regarding cost. And I think my thoughts about that now have been further refined with that lens, because it's not always our lens, right? And I think what it means is that that lens has to be applied in our relationship with the CPUC and the CEC, right? That's a responsibility all of us carry. And so to that end, I'm very keen on the monitoring. To the points that Angelina was making, I don't think we want to be in a situation where a year from now people are severely criticizing us for not having leveled the playing field appropriately. So that's where, you know, with my support today, the cautionary tale about it is I'll be looking to see that we did effectively level the playing field, and that we will bring to the process of our relationship with the CPUC and the CEC this appreciation about real costs, about what each of our roles do in terms of contributing to that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'll just close this discussion out a little bit by noting the fact that there actually was a great deal of consensus around the need to do something, and to do something sooner rather than later. We are in a situation that is unmanageable, and we have to move forward. You heard the earlier comments. We are supposed to be connecting 7,000 megawatts a year for the foreseeable future. So we cannot stand still. We also have a FERC order that we need to comply with. So whether we liked it or not, we have to move forward with the changes that are being mandated at the federal level. Severin touched on the fact that the staff did explore the idea of an auction solution. I always count on Severin to bring that up as a possible fix. And my understanding is that generally speaking, was not the solution that was supported by the stakeholders who have been participating for more than a year. So the alternative we've come up with is to use scoring criteria to help winnow down the field of projects that are going to be seeking to be connected. The new and probably most controversial component of the proposal that the staff has put before us, as we all know, is the allocation of points to load-serving entities who have resource adequacy obligations under state law to keep the lights on, to plan for their load, and to assure that the resources are there to keep the lights on in California. The CPUC has come forward, and as strong a letter as I think I've ever seen come out of them, endorsed this approach and has promised to continue to work with us under the MOU, and I'm sure the CEC will too, to assure that we end up with a fair and reasonable and successful process that will get resources connected in the time frame that we need them to be connected. I will say we had a number of comments that came in from people suggesting that we delay this process further so that we can work on it and refine it more. I think we can always, as we've talked about, continue to improve the decisions that we make, and to monitor very closely to determine what changes should be made, because we are going to go first with this approach. But I will also say that at least my assessment is that I don't think delaying this decision is going to reach any agreement over this question of whether or not to assign points the way we're proposing to assign them. And as a result, I think that's the policy call for the board in moving the staff's proposal forward. It is new. It will be different. Things don't end here. As we all know, we will have to make a FERC tariff filing. There will be yet other opportunities for people to come in and make their viewpoints known, and we will find out whether or not FERC thinks this is the reasonable approach settled on by Californians to meet California's resource adequacy obligations going forward. So with that long speech, I will close it out And I will ask whether or not, oh, actually, I think I have to turn it over to Roger to read the potential motion that the staff is recommending.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, governors, and all commenters. Move that the ISO Board of Governors approves the proposed Track 2 interconnection process enhancements as described in the memorandum dated June 6, 2024. And move that the ISO Board of Governors authorizes management to make all necessary and appropriate filings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to implement the proposal, including any filings that implement the overarching initiative policy, but contain discrete revisions to incorporate commission guidance in any initial ruling on the proposed tariff amendment. Have a motion, please.
So moved.
Thank you, Governor Bornstein. Second.
Second.
Thank you, Governor Leslie. Governor Bornstein, your vote, please.
Aye.
Governor Edo.
Aye.
Governor Galitova.
Aye.
Governor Leslie.
Aye.
And Chair Shorey.
Aye.
Congratulations, governors. The motion passes.
Thank you very much, everyone. I know this has been a long process, and of course, it's not over. We still have a lot of work ahead of us, but I do want to thank everyone for participating, for offering your comments today. And I think that we are ready to march off into this new future together. So I will adjourn today's meeting. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Jan.